and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the London School of Emerging Technology. It's wonderful to have founders, entrepreneurs, startup teams, students and business professionals joining us from different parts of the world. Today's session explores a challenge that almost every startup experiences, but very few recognise until it's too late. The title of today's webinar is Invisible Revenue Killers: Why Great Startups Still Fail to Convert Customers. This session isn't about building another marketing strategy or learning how to generate more website traffic. Instead, we're going to look beneath the surface and understand why businesses with innovative products, talented teams, and even significant funding often struggle to convert customers and generate sustainable revenue. What makes today's session unique is that it's built almost entirely around real startup stories, real business decisions, and real lessons from companies that have either transformed their industries or paid a heavy price for overlooking seemingly small issues. Leading us through these insights is someone who has worked closely with founders and early-stage businesses, helping them validate ideas, refine business models, and navigate the challenges of startup growth. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Amy Kohl, Startup Advisor at LSET. Amy, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and hello everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I always really appreciate everyone investing your time to be here. So whenever founders kind of think about increasing their revenue, the first instinct is to usually ask, how do I get more customers? How do I increase website traffic? How do I spend more on advertising? And then how do I generate leads? And they are important questions, but today I want to ask something completely different. So what if the biggest problem isn't actually attracting those customers? What if it's the invisible reasons that they're not buying in the first place? So throughout today's webinar, we'll explore companies that many of us actually admire. So from Slack, Dropbox, Netflix, Airbnb, Basecamp, HubSpot, Duolingo, and Zoom. And we're going to examine the critical decisions that they made, the mistakes that they avoided, or in some cases actually initially made, and then the lessons that every founder can apply to their own business. This isn't necessarily going to be a lecture. This is more of a boardroom discussion where we're going to analyze real business decisions together. So I want to begin with one quick question. And without overthinking it, ask yourself, where do you believe that your biggest challenge is today? Is it getting more customers, converting interested customers, retaining existing customers? You don't need to type your answer in the chat right now. Just keep it in mind, because at the end of this session, I really hope that you're going to have a much clearer understanding of where your biggest opportunity actually lies. One of the biggest misconceptions in entrepreneurship is believing that more traffic automatically leads to more revenue. And today's webinar is about challenging that assumption.
What an interesting perspective, because I think many founders immediately associate revenue growth with marketing spend or customer acquisition. But as we'll discover today, the answer is often much deeper. So let's begin by understanding why this topic is so important for every founder, regardless of their stage of business. Amy, before we dive into case studies, I'd like to start with a simple question. When we hear about successful startups, we often focus on funding rounds, valuations, and product launches. Yet many companies with excellent products still struggle to convert customers. Why does that happen?
I think it's because we often confuse having a great product with having a successful business, and they're not necessarily the same thing. I've met founders who have spent years perfecting their product. They've built a really impressive technology. They've assembled really talented teams, and they've had positive feedback from all of their early users. Yet months and months later, their revenue still remains really flat. And that's because customers don't necessarily buy products simply because they're just innovative. They buy products that actually solve a problem that's clear, that's quick, and that has very little friction as possible. So a founder might say, our software has 50 incredible features, but the customers are actually asking, can this solve my problem right now? And that's a completely different conversation to have. And if the founder can't answer that question immediately, that conversion becomes a lot harder. So I want you to think about your own buying decisions. Have you ever visited a website and genuinely liked their product, but then not decided to go ahead and purchase? It often wasn't because the product was poor, and maybe it was because the pricing wasn't clear. Maybe you couldn't really understand the value, and maybe, creating an account might have felt like too much effort, or perhaps you decided to come back later and then you just forgot and never did. Those small moments happen every day across thousands of different startups, and each one of those quietly reduces the overall revenue. So as you're listening today, I would like you to think about this. Have you ever lost a customer without knowing exactly why? So I want you to reflect on that question, because today's case studies are really about uncovering those hidden reasons. Because customers rarely say, I'm leaving because your conversion journey had too much friction. They simply just leave. And it's your responsibility as a founder to understand why that is.
That's a really useful distinction. Customers don't usually explain why they leave. Founders have to become investigators. So let's begin investigating by looking at some numbers that every founder should understand. Before we analyse the stories of well-known companies, your presentation starts with statistics that really set the scene, Amy. Could you walk us through why these numbers matter?
Absolutely. So let's begin with the first statistic. Around about 90% of startups fail. And one of the most frequently cited reasons is because of the lack of market need. And that's according to CB Insights. Now, if we think about that, it doesn't say that they failed because they couldn't build a software or because they lacked ambition. It says that they've built something that the market actually didn't need, or they didn't communicate its value effectively enough. So let's look at the second statistic. So research from Brain & Company shows that improving customer retention by only 5% can actually increase profits by anywhere between 25 and 95%, which is obviously a remarkable statistic. And many founders chase the next 100 customers whilst they're actually quietly losing the customers that they've worked so hard initially to acquire. So retention just isn't another customer success metric. It has to be built into your revenue strategy. And then finally, the Harvard Business Review tells us that acquiring a new customer typically costs 5 to 7 times more than actually retaining an existing one. So if you think about your own startup, every pound, dollar, rupee you spend on attracting a new customer becomes significantly more valuable if that customer actually stays with you. So if they leave after one purchase, you've not only lost that future revenue, but then you've increased the acquisition cost for every future customer. So the next question I want every founder to think about: if attracting customers is expensive, why do we spend so much time looking for new customers instead of understanding why our existing prospects don't actually convert? And that single question has transformed some of the world's most successful startups. So without sharing your answer, think about your own business. So if you had to improve just one area today, would it be your customer acquisition, your conversion, or your retention? And by the end of this webinar, I really hope that you'll know exactly where your biggest revenue opportunity is. A little insight is the fastest way to grow revenue isn't always about increasing the traffic. Very often it's about improving the experience of the customers who've already shown interest in buying from you.
I think that's a perfect foundation for today's discussion. And we've established why this topic matters. So let's move away from theory and into the real world. Our first case study is one of the most fascinating startup pivots in modern business history. A company that many people think was an overnight success, but whose journey began with complete failure. So let's explore what Slack teaches us about finding revenue where founders least expect it. As I said, we've established why revenue challenges often have nothing to do with marketing budgets or product quality. So let's begin with our first story. Amy, when people think of Slack today, they think of one of the world's leading workplace communication platforms. But very few people know that Slack wasn't actually the company's original business. Can you tell us that story, please?
Absolutely. So Slack is one of my favorite startup stories because it completely changes the way that we think about success. So when Stuart Butterfield and his team started their company, they weren't trying to build a workplace communication software. Their goal at the time was completely different. They were developing an online multiplayer game called Glitch. So the team invested years designing this game. They hired really talented developers and they even raised investment. They built an incredible product. But despite all of that effort, the market simply didn't respond the way that they'd actually hoped for. So the game really struggled to gain traction. Now, imagine yourself as the founder. You've invested years of your life. Your team believes in the wider vision. Your investors are watching. And this is where many founders make the biggest mistakes. It's that they'll continue investing in something that the market has already actually rejected. But the Slack team did something different here. So instead of asking, how do we save this game, this product that we've built, they asked a much better question. And it's, what have we built that people genuinely find valuable? So during their development, the team had created an internal communication tool to help coordinate their work. And it wasn't the product that they initially intended to sell. It was simply something that they just used to help their own team collaboration. And then they realized that other businesses needed that tool far more than they needed the online game that they'd created. And that insight had completely changed the company's future. They completely closed the game. They focused entirely on the communication platform. And that platform is what we now know as Slack.
Wow, what an interesting story, and such an important point in that they didn't invent something completely new. They recognised the value in something that they'd almost overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. So many founders become really emotionally attached to their original idea. The Slack founders became attached to solving a problem instead. And that is a completely different mindset. So today, Slack serves millions of professionals around the world because the founders actually listens to what the market valued and not just what they originally planned to build. So I'd like everyone to think about this question. Is there something inside your own product that customers value more than the feature that you're spending most of your time developing? Sometimes your next £1 million product is actually already inside your business. You just haven't actually recognized it yet.
Our next case study teaches us that before building a product, founders should first confirm that customers actually want it. Amy, Dropbox is now one of the most recognized cloud storage companies in the world. But according to this slide, they didn't start by building a finished product. What did they do instead?
So this is actually one of the smartest examples of customer validation that I've seen. In 2007, cloud storage wasn't something that people fully understood. So Drew Houston, Dropbox founder, he believed that people needed a much more simpler way to access files across different devices. So instead of spending years building every single possible feature, he made a really bold decision. And he created a demonstration video. It was just a few minutes long. And the video showed exactly how Dropbox would solve a real world problem. It wasn't complicated. There was no finished polished product. And there wasn't a big marketing campaign. It was just a really clear explanation on the customer experience. And the response was incredible. So within a really short period, around 75,000 people joined the waiting list. And that's huge. Dropbox hadn't validated the technology yet. They hadn't even validated the demand. And that is the huge difference.
Wow. So the waiting list became proof that people wanted the solution.
Yeah, so many founders ask, can we build it? But then Dropbox actually asks, should we build it? And they are two completely different questions. One focuses on the engineering, and then the other focuses on the business. And a successful startup always answers the business question first. So as you're listening today, I want you to ask yourself, have you ever built a feature because you believed that your customers wanted it, or because customers actually told you that they needed it? And that distinction really matters. Validation reduces the overall risk, and then assumptions increase it.
Yeah. Our next story isn't just about a startup. It's about one of the biggest missed opportunities in business history: the cost of ignoring customer behaviour. This comparison is fascinating because both companies operated in the same industry, yet one completely transformed entertainment while the other almost disappeared. Amy, what made the difference?
Yeah, so I think the biggest difference wasn't the technology, it was just purely the perspective. So back in 2000, Netflix approached Blockbuster with a huge offer. The founders proposed selling Netflix for around $50 million at the time, and Blockbuster declined that proposal. So at the time, the decision seemed really reasonable. Blockbuster dominated the video rental market. They had thousands of stores, millions of customers, and a huge, strong brand recognition. So why would they buy a small DVD by mail company? And it's because they misunderstood what the customers actually wanted. So Blockbuster believed that people wanted to rent DVDs. Netflix believed that people wanted convenience. And that's an incredibly important distinction. Customers, as we've said, rarely buy the products, they buy the outcomes, they buy the solution. Netflix kept asking, how do we make entertainment easier? But Blockbuster kept asking, how do we improve our existing stores? So one company focused on the future, and then one of them protected the past.
Bet someone's kicking themselves over that decision. So one company was protecting its business model and the other was preparing for changing customer behaviour.
Yeah, exactly. And founders face this challenge every day. Sometimes your biggest competitor isn't another startup, it's actually your own success. So when things are going well, it's tempting to assume that they're just going to continue going that way. But the markets always evolve, and so do customer expectations and technology. And great founders evolve with them. So I'd like you to have a good think about this. If your customers' behavior changed dramatically over the next 2 years, would your current business model still work? And that's a question that every founder should revisit on a regular basis, because the biggest revenue killer isn't competition. It's actually assuming that tomorrow's customer is going to behave like yesterday's.
That's so interesting. So our next company took almost the opposite approach. Instead of adding more and more features, they became successful by deliberately saying no. I think this is a lesson that many startups struggle with. Founders often believe more features make a better product, but Basecamp chose a different path.
Yeah, and that's exactly why Basecamp has remained so respected for so many years. As the product became more popular and customers naturally requested more features, from dashboards, integration, setting, customizations. And for many startups, they would happily add everything because it's a customer demand. Surely that must have been the right thing to do. But Basecamp looked at the bigger picture. They realized that every additional feature also increased the complexity of their product. Every new button meant another decision for users. Every new option created another opportunity for confusion. So instead of asking themselves, what can we add? They continue to ask themselves, how can we keep this really simple? And that philosophy helped them create a product that people could understand quickly, adopt easily, and then continue to use consistently. So sometimes saying no creates far more value than always saying yes.
It's such an interesting mindset because founders often equate innovation with adding more.
Yeah, and innovation isn't always about just adding more, it's about subtraction sometimes. The best products aren't necessarily the one with the more features, they're just the ones that solve one important problem exceptionally well. So ask yourself this: if you had to remove 30% of your product tomorrow, which features would you confidently keep? And the answer often reveals where your real value lies.
Excellent. Oh, sorry.
Complexity, sorry, just
Mm,
one more point. Complexity rarely increases conversions, it's about clarity.
brilliant. So far we've explored four very different companies. Slack taught us to recognize unexpected opportunities. Dropbox showed us the power of validating demand before building. Netflix reminded us to follow changing customer behavior. And Basecamp demonstrated that simplicity can be a competitive advantage. In the next part, we're going to make this even more practical with an interactive boardroom exercise, followed by case studies from Airbnb, HubSpot, Duolingo, and Zoom. We'll explore how these companies identified and fixed invisible revenue killers that many startups overlook. Now, it's your turn to think like a founder, or even better, think like the CEO sitting in on a Monday morning board meeting. Amy's prepared three startups. All of them look healthy at first glance, but only one is actually performing well. Amy, let's analyse them.
Thank you. So, one of the biggest mistakes that founders make is actually measuring success using only one number. And sometimes it's website traffic or revenue or social media followers. But businesses are never built on just one single metric. So, let's take a look at these three startups. We'll start with Startup A. So, this company receives 100,000 website visitors every single month. Obviously, most founders would celebrate that, but there's another number to consider. Only 0.6% of those visitors actually then become paying customers. So have a good think about that. Imagine filling a stadium with 100,000 people, yet only 600 decide to buy. So the question isn't how do we then get another 50,000 visitors? The better question is why is 99,400 people leaving without buying anything? And that's a really lost opportunity there. And that's where the opportunity exists.
Yeah, makes sense. I think many founders would immediately invest more in marketing without questioning what happens after visitors arrive.
Yeah, and that's exactly why this becomes a real invisible revenue killer. So now let's look at Startup B. This company receives only 20,000 visitors each month. Obviously, a much smaller audience, but this is the difference. The conversion rate is 4.5, so almost 8 times higher than Startup A. That means that this business is turning attention into revenue much more efficiently. They've got less traffic, but they have far better results. And that's a sign of a much healthier business.
Yeah, and really demonstrates that higher traffic doesn't necessarily mean higher performance.
Exactly. So let's move on to Startup C. These have only got 10,000 visitors each month. And at first glance, that appears like the weakest business out of the three. But then we discover something, and it's their customer retention is 80%, which is incredible. Their customers keep coming back, they continue paying, they recommend their product. And then over time, each customer becomes significantly more valuable. And founders often underestimate retention because it isn't as exciting as acquisition. But financially, retention is one of the strongest growth engines that a business can actually have. So as you're listening, ask yourself, if you had to improve just one metric over the next 6 months, which one would you choose? Would you choose more website traffic, better conversion, or higher retention? So keep that answer in mind as we continue. So the lesson here is that traffic creates opportunities, and then conversion creates customers. But then retention creates a much more sustainable business. The strongest companies don't chase those vanity metrics. They optimize the numbers that generates the long-term revenue.
Yeah, indeed. So once customers finally arrive, though, what happens next? Our next company discovered that the biggest obstacle wasn't attracting visitors, it was something much simpler: the customer experience problem. So, Airbnb is one of the most recognized technology companies in the world today, but their early story was very different. Amy, what happened?
So in 2009, Airbnb faced a really serious problem. People were visiting the website and the listings were available. The new idea was really exciting, yet their bookings still remained really disappointingly low. So imagine being one of those founders. It's tempting to believe that the solution is just more advertising or more marketing. But instead, the founders traveled to New York. They personally visited those Airbnb hosts and they wanted to understand why their customers weren't booking. And what they discovered actually surprised them. It wasn't the apartments that was the problem, it was the photos. It had poor lighting, blurry images, and just a really unattractive presentation of what was to offer. And customers just simply couldn't trust what they were seeing. Instead of redesigning the entire platform and instead of launching another advertising campaign, the founders rented professional cameras and photographed these properties themselves. And almost immediately, those bookings doubled.
Wow, that's incredible. The product hadn't changed at all, but just the customer experience of booking had.
Yeah, exactly. So that's obviously a really important distinction where sometimes founders spend months improving their product, where the real issue exists somewhere completely different, and that's in their customer journey.
Yeah. And the second company on this slide, HubSpot, they experienced something very similar.
Yeah, so HubSpot noticed customers weren't staying as long as they expected. So a lot of companies would immediately assume that their software needed some improvement. But instead, HubSpot studied their customers' behavior. They discovered that customers weren't leaving because the software was difficult. They were leaving because the onboarding process was really confusing. So people just simply didn't know how to get value from their software quickly. So rather than rebuilding their platform, HubSpot redesigned the onboarding experience. They made tutorials really clear, their customer guidance improved, their early engagement then increased, and retention improved significantly. So again, the invisible revenue killer wasn't the product, it was just the surrounding experience of the product. So again, I'd like everyone to think about your own business. If a customer stopped using your product after 1 week, would you know exactly why? And that's an important question that every founder needs to ask. Customers don't just abandon your products overnight. They usually abandon confusing experiences long before they abandon the actual product itself.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. So we've seen how customer experience influences revenue. Now let's explore another invisible factor: human behavior. Another case study: designing for human behavior. Amy, Duolingo teaches languages, Zoom hosts video meetings. They're completely different businesses, yet you've included them together. Why is that?
I think it's because both companies understood something incredibly important. Technology alone doesn't just create loyal customers, it's the habits that do. So let's start with Duolingo. Obviously, learning a language is difficult. A lot of people start really enthusiastically, and very few of those continue consistently. So Duolingo realised that the biggest challenge wasn't actually the education piece, it was around the motivation. So instead of changing those language lessons, they changed the behaviour. They added daily streaks, achievements, small celebrations, progress tracking. Every tiny success encouraged users to return tomorrow. The product didn't become easier, the experience just became more rewarding.
Oh, fantastic. So they designed it around human psychology.
Yeah, 100%. So let's look at Zoom. During the pandemic, demand for video meetings increased dramatically. But remember, Zoom wasn't the only platform that was available at that time. So the question to ask is, why did millions of people choose that specific platform? And it's because joining a meeting required literally no effort. It was just one click, really minimal setup, and it had a really clear interface and a fast connection. Every unnecessary step was removed to avoid friction. Every removed click increased the adoption of their product. And customers rarely notice the simplicity, they just simply continue to use it. So again, ask yourself this. If someone experienced your product for the very first time today, would they know exactly what to do with it in the first 60 seconds? Because people don't become loyal because the technology is impressive. They become loyal because the experience feels really effortless.
Fascinating. So we've explored several companies, each identified a different invisible revenue killer. Now it's time to diagnose our own businesses. Amy, this is probably one of the most practical slides in today's webinar. We've created a simple founder self-assessment. How should our audience approach this?
Fab. So this is where the discussion comes a lot more personal to you. So on your screen, you'll see several areas of your business: your message clarity, website experience, pricing, sales approach or sales process, follow-up, and then customer retention. Now, imagine giving each of these areas a score out of 5. So don't necessarily worry about perfection. I just want you to be honest. Which one of those receives the lowest score? Because that's probably where your biggest invisible revenue leak actually exists. Many founders immediately say, we just need more leads. But then hopefully after doing this exercise, you'll discover the real issue is something entirely different. So maybe your pricing isn't clear, or your follow-ups is inconsistent, and maybe your customers don't actually understand the value proposition. And those small weaknesses quietly reduce your revenue every single day.
I think this is incredibly helpful because it shifts the conversation from blaming the market to improving what founders can actually control.
Yeah, exactly. So revenue growth doesn't always require a huge dramatic change. Sometimes it just begins with fixing one really overlooked step in the customer journey. So the companies that we've discussed today, they didn't just become massively successful because they spent more money. They became successful because they actually paid attention to what was going on in their customer journey. So as we prepare for the final section of this webinar, I want you to identify just one area of your business that you want to improve over the next 30 days. And keep that commitment with you as we move on to the closing discussion. Because revenue isn't just lost in one big mistake. It's usually lost through dozens of small moments of friction that founders never actually notice.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. So we've analysed real companies, we've identified invisible revenue killers, and we've diagnosed our own businesses. To conclude today's session, Amy will answer some of the most common questions founders ask about revenue growth, share final recommendations, and introduce an exciting opportunity through the LSET Startup Incubator. We've looked at companies like Slack, Dropbox, Netflix, Airbnb, Basecamp, HubSpot, Duolingo, and Zoom, and identified hidden problems that were quietly affecting revenue. The common thread in all these stories wasn't that they had more funding or better technology. It was that they asked better questions, listened to their customers, and were willing to improve the parts of the business that most people ignored. Before we conclude, let's move into a Q&A session. These are some of the questions founders frequently ask when trying to improve revenue and customer conversion. So, Amy, a question for you. My startup isn't getting enough customers. Should I focus on marketing first?
Not necessarily. So marketing brings more people to your business, but marketing alone doesn't create that revenue. So the first question that I would ask is, what happens after my customers arrive? So imagine your website receives 1,000 visitors, but then only 5 of them buy. Increasing that traffic to 2,000 visitors won't automatically just solve the problem. Instead, you need to understand why and where customers actually leave. So, is your value proposition clear? Is your pricing really confusing? Does the buying process feel really complicated? So, touching on companies like Airbnb, they improve their revenue without spending heavily on advertising. They focus purely on improving the customer experience first. So, before you increase your marketing budget, you need to optimize the conversion journey. So, more traffic will obviously multiply your strengths, but it also multiplies your weaknesses. So, like I said, fix the customer journey before you then start scaling your marketing.
That's brilliant. So helpful. Thank you. And so, another question for you. How do I know whether pricing is the problem?
So, founders often assume that price is the issue because customers always are going to say it's too expensive. But expensive in comparison to what? Customers usually evaluate their value before they evaluate the price. And if they clearly understood the outcome of that your product delivers, they'll often pay more and be willing to. So instead of immediately just reducing the prices, you need to ask yourself, have I explained the return on investment? Does my pricing page answer the most common questions that come up? Do customers understand the value before seeing the price of the product? So most often than not, improving that communication increases the conversions far more than just throwing discounts out there, because customers don't always buy the cheapest products. They always buy the products that clearly solve that problem first.
Excellent. A fantastic lesson and can save some lost revenue.
Yeah.
So, another question for you. We receive lots of demo requests, but very few paying customers. Where should we look first?
Yeah, so that's obviously a really common situation. And the first place that I would investigate is the transition between the demo and then the follow-up. So a lot of founders deliver a really, really good demonstration of their product and then assume that the customer is just going to return. But buying decisions often require a lot more reassurance than you initially expect. So you need to kind of understand, how quickly are you going to follow up? Are you answering all the objections that comes up? And then are you making that next step really simple? So you can't kind of wait for the customer, because that momentum disappears really quickly. The faster and more relevant that you follow up, the greater that your chances of converting interest turns then into revenue. So revenue is often lost after the conversion, not during that process.
Excellent. Thank you. And so, another question for you. How often should founders speak to their customers?
So this is really simple, all the time. Customer conversion shouldn't happen only when the revenue starts failing. The companies that we've discussed today, so whether that was Airbnb, visiting hosts, or HubSpot, analyzing onboarding, they've built that learning into their culture. So you need to schedule regular conversations. Observe how customers actually use your product. Always ask open-ended questions, because you'll get a lot more out of that than just a yes or no answer. And just understand that markets evolve and your customer expectations will always evolve. And then your understanding also needs to evolve with that too. Every customer conversation is market research you actually don't have to pay for. So it's definitely worth doing.
Yeah, important lesson to remember as well. Okay, and another one for you. Can adding more features actually reduce sales?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we mentioned, Basecamp is actually one of the best examples of this. So many founders believe every customer request should then automatically just become a feature, but every additional feature increases the complexity of your software. So customers don't just buy software because it has more features. They always buy software because it solves that one important problem that they have, and it solves it exceptionally well. So before adding something new, you need to ask, will this product actually will this product make it easier to understand, or will it be harder? And if the answer's harder, then you need to think really carefully about building that. Complexity always increases hesitation, and it's the simplicity that increases the confidence.
Excellent. Another valid point. And I guess there's the financial implications to consider when you're adding on all the time as well, at the cost point, at the development point.
Yeah.
So another question for you, Amy. If you could measure only one metric every week, what would it be?
So that's a difficult question to answer because every single business is different. However, I'd encourage founders to focus on a metric that reflects their customer behavior rather than just vanity. Don't look at follow account, look at the engagement, who's commenting on your posts, for example. And for many startups, retention is the powerful indicator. So if customers are continuing to return, they're recommending your product and they're staying engaged, that's often a sign that you're creating genuine value. And the revenue matters, the traffic matters, but your customer behavior actually tells that story. So customers vote with their behavior and not with surveys.
Excellent, thank you. And just one final question for you. What's the single biggest lesson founders should remember after today's webinar?
So I guess if I had to summarize today's discussion in one sentence, it would be that revenue problems are rarely caused by just one major mistake, and they're usually created by dozens of small moments where customers often become confused, frustrated, uncertain, or simply just lose the momentum. So the companies that we've explored today, they didn't become successful because they found more customers. They became successful because they removed those invisible barriers. And that is the mindset that I'd encourage every founder to take back to their own business. The fastest way to grow isn't always to find more customers. It's to make it easier for those existing prospects to say yes to your product.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. And as we bring today's webinar to a close, we'd also like to introduce an opportunity for founders who are ready to take the next step in building and growing their businesses.
So throughout today's webinar, we've talked about customer validation, product positioning, revenue optimization, and the founder decision making. So these aren't one-time activities, they're a continuous process. So that's exactly why programs like the LSET Startup Incubator exists. So the incubator is designed to help founders move from the idea to a scalable business through structured guidance and practical support. You'll have opportunities to refine your business model, validate your product with expert feedback, learn from experienced mentors, develop investor-ready strategies, and connect with a community of ambitious entrepreneurs. One of the biggest advantages of joining an incubator is that you don't have to solve all of these problems alone. Sometimes a simple conversation or just a different perspective can save months of unnecessary work. So successful founders don't grow alone. They build with mentors, communities, and have that continuous learning piece throughout.
Thank you, Amy. I think the phrase "a problem shared is a problem halved" is always a valid one.
Absolutely.
So if today's session has encouraged you to look at your business differently, I'd encourage you to explore the LSET Startup Incubator. You can scan the QR code on your screen or visit the website to learn more. And well, everyone, we've reached the end of today's webinar. And on behalf of the London School of Emerging Technology, thank you so much for joining us. Amy, before we close, would you like to leave our audience with one final thought?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. And obviously, thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. I'd like to leave you with one final reflection. So when founders think about growth, they often ask themselves, how do we find more customers? But after today's session, I really hope that you'll begin to ask yourselves a different question. And that is, why are more of the customers we already have, why aren't they becoming loyal advocates? And every startup has invisible revenue killers. There's a difference between successful companies and struggling ones. And it's not because the successful companies don't have problems. It's that they identify those problems earlier and take action before they become really expensive. So this week, I'd like to encourage you to return to your business and ask yourselves these 3 simple questions. So why are customers dropping off? What creates unnecessary friction? And what is one improvement that could make the buying process easier? You obviously don't need to change everything overnight, but start by improving one part of your customer journey. And these small improvements made consistently often create bigger long-term results. So thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I wish every one of you success and continue building businesses that customers not only choose, but they keep coming back to. So great startups don't simply attract attention. They remove friction, build trust, and create experiences that customers want to return to.
Thank you once again, Amy, for such an insightful session. And thank you to everyone who has joined us live or watching later. If you found today's webinar valuable for London School of Emerging Technology, founder-focused webinars, practical workshops, and startup learning opportunities. We hope to see you again soon. Until then, keep learning, keep experimenting, and keep building with your customers at the center of every decision. Have a wonderful day.